My hot take is that product managers don't need to be technical. And so when I say I don't think product managers need to be technical, I think that by and large, what you're really there to do is to build something of value for a customer. Most of the customers that we have, by and large, are not technical. I think it is actually bad that unless your product is a highly technical one, being technical actually hurts your relationship with your engineers.
Hello and welcome to another episode of One Night in Product Hot Takes Edition, where I speak to one person about one thing, get straight to the point and find out what's on their mind. Now, if you've got your own hot take, why not head over to onenightinproduct.com/hot and grab a time where you can have a chat and share your hot take with the world. But in any case, do remember to subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube so you can make sure you never miss another episode again. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get straight to Chris Butler's hot take. All right, so in front of me I see a wood-panelled, kind of like a cabin or something with some light outside, much lighter and brighter out in the US than it is over here. But I also see a man with a microphone and a smile on his face. So I'll throw over to you and ask you to introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're from, what you do for a living, and most importantly, what is your hot take?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Chris Butler, and I'm the staff product operations manager at GitHub, focused on AI products. I'm in Oakland, California, which is very close to San Francisco, and so I go into the offices there. But we're a remote company, so I don't have to usually. And then I guess I would say my hot take is that product managers don't need to be technical. And I realize that can be a little inflammatory. I think one of the most hated TikToks I've ever been in was when I said that PM should not have to be technical. And so, Apple user 134 kept on saying I was an idiot, and that probably I didn't know what I was talking about. So that's what I'm here to talk about.
All right. So clearly I'm going to have questions about that. And I know that you came from a technical background. I've come from a technical background. We've probably both pushed a bit of code. You work for a company that's all about pushing code as well, right? So tech is in our blood, right? But
yeah,
I guess the first thing to kind of clarify is what do you mean by technical? Do you just mean that they shouldn't be developers, or do you mean that they shouldn't care about technology at all? Like where are you on the kind of spectrum of what technology even means in this context?
Well, so I think the dreaded Venn diagram of PMs is the thing that I think started a lot of this, which is that we're supposed to be some type of combination of tech, user, and business. And I think what a lot of people interpret that as is that we should be all of those things and we should be good at all of this stuff. But when the reality is when you enter a team, especially one that is maybe more established, a larger company, something like that, you end up actually having not just a Venn diagram, but some type of N diagram of different stakeholders, expertise, things like that. So for example, I've worked in a lot of different companies like Facebook, Google, GitHub, Microsoft, that have had to have a lot of legal representation in certain types of product decisions. And so I am not a legal expert. I'm definitely not, right? I've learned over time, what is maybe onerous in a contract after I've done a couple when I was doing business development. But I would argue that it's not my job to be a legal expert. What my job is as a product manager is to bring in all of those expertise and provide the right type of tension between them to make the best decisions. And so when I say I don't think product managers need to be technical, I think that by and large, what you're really there to do is to build something of value for a customer. And because of that, most of the customers that we have, by and large, are not technical. And so, when it comes to something like GitHub, absolutely, our customers are developers. I would argue that the reason why I joined GitHub, though, is because there's all these other people that also help build products that are not just engineers. And so the thing that's really exciting to me from a vision perspective is actually how do we enable the entire team? So I definitely think that PMs that are, say, working on APIs or working on a developer product maybe need to understand more about that. But I think we could even go further here and say that what we really need is a shared language that product management is really owning and helping develop between all of the different expertise inside of the organization. And so this may be related to a story that there's a paper I read that was, I think it was from the 90s, that was called trading zones. And so trading zones as a concept is this idea that when we go somewhere where there's a bunch of different practices potentially, and this was actually the way they ended up coming to this paper was looking at the way that the development of the nuclear bomb took place. And so while this is a little bit of a dark material,
I could say nice light topic.
Nice and light, exactly. But you had people that were theoretical physicists like Einstein. You had people that were experts in mechanisms of bomb making. You had experts in actually the idea of sensors for all of this stuff. And they all had very, very different expertise and practice in the way that they did things. But they had to come together to actually do something that was never done before. And so in that case, they had to create what is referred to as a trading zone of kind of ideas and information, where you can find a common language that doesn't require deep understanding of the expertise that are involved. And so I think that's what I keep on thinking about is like, what is this trading zone of language that we need to build? I would argue that it's usually customer focused, whatever that is, right? How are the customers doing this? And a lot of like domain driven design and those types of groups have really tried to get at that. Even service design tries to use the idea of like, what is the language that people have, right? And so that's, I guess, like that's my kind of main argument is that what we're really trying to do is find a common language to be able to talk about trade-offs. We're not trying to actually make the PM the expert in the technology. And I can definitely give you some examples from my career where I've found that was not helpful, actually. And maybe even going a step further, I think it is actually bad that unless your product is a highly technical one, being technical actually hurts your relationship with your engineers.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions, actually. So, again, being a techie myself and having been a developer for many years, like I can sit there and I can think, well, it's okay for me. But at the same time, you know, I put it in this, I did a presentation or a talk once, actually, where I had that Venn diagram that you kind of referred to and with a little red dot in the middle. And I kind of had this idea that the red dot slowly starts to drift over to one of the circles because that's the one you're most comfortable in. And you sit there and say, well, okay, well, I'm a technical guy. And therefore, when times are hard, when times are tough, when I can't bother to have that kind of difficult conversation with the marketing team, or whatever, then I automatically start to drift back over to my zone of most competence. And talk to my engineering buddies because I have spent so much of my career being an engineer.
That's right.
So is it just that, or like, what are some of the other things that you might expect to see if the PMs are too technical? Like, what negative behaviors do you think that can drive in a team?
I mean, I think one of the things I see a lot of the time is the way that roadmaps are created. And so what ends up happening is you'll create a roadmap that is full of like highly technical jargon that is about what the thing is that's being built rather than what is the customer problem, right? And so, you know, as you can imagine, GitHub is a very engineering driven place. The last place I was at was Google in the core machine learning group, which is incredibly engineering driven. You know, so I would just say that like that is a kind of anti-pattern or something that you can start to see that PMs are being or allowing for too much of a technical focus ends up being the way the roadmaps look. And it doesn't even have to just be like when you try to show a roadmap to a customer and say, you know, what do you think about this? Or like, I have no idea what any of this jargon means, but it's also even between teams, right? When we start talking about collaboration between silos, the language and the technology ends up being so specific to that silo that even other people in other silos don't understand what's going on, right? And so I think that's like one way to view that. I mean, maybe another story, like when there was like an anti-pattern almost of trying to be technical. I was working at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, which I still love. I still have one on my TV. It's one of the best ways to have like a video calling system on your biggest screen in your house. They unfortunately canceled the project after I left. I don't think it was because I left, but you know. Anyways,
it was because you left. Come on, you got to take the W or the L, whichever way around it is.
Exactly. Well, so it was like I worked a lot on identity, like how is it we understand who's working with the device, and then what does that mean from like security, privacy, all these things. I also worked on basically biometric recognition, so like not only voice pattern recognition, like is this person who I think is that's talking, but also who's in front of the device, right? And so one of the things that was really interesting about that was that when I was working with the kind of ML engineer about how do we adopt a model that does not only basically face detection, which is the first step, but then face identification, we started getting all these questions that were highly technical, like what are like the lumens of the room that are appropriate for being able to recognize someone? Or what is the pixel size of the face that we're willing to do this? Or like the idea of like similarities inside of houses, for example, you're more likely to live someone that looks like you because you have children or family members or something like that. So there's a lot of like weird things that you can start to dive really deep into the actual machine learning like use. When the reality is the better questions were kind of what were some of the problems that might happen if we actually if we identify someone as someone else, what is the kind of weirdness or problem or awkwardness or breaking of household norms that might happen in that case? And if that is possible, like what are the things that we should actually be offering from functionality standpoint, like as a like what the person can do with the device? Those were way better conversations. And we started getting into this idea of even just like what is acceptable as far as like false positive and false negative, which is a little bit of a statistical term. I agree. But like, it's more about the use cases that were more important for me to have that conversation with the ML engineer. When I would start to try to get very technical, they would say like, take a step back. Like, we don't need to know all this stuff. Like, I'm going to work on that for you, right? And they were a great engineering leader because they understood that unless they really had an understanding of that like deeper usage and kind of user need, they were not going to be able to build the right thing into the technology, which a lot of people hadn't done at that point. Now Google has like face match and a couple of things, and they're dealing with a lot of problems with that too, probably. But like, that's what I'd say is like, that's an example of where being too technical actually got us away from what was the end use of that feature.
There's an interesting point there, and something that I kind of thought as you kind of came out with the original hot take, as well as this idea that, you know, product managers being quote unquote too technical, too in the weeds with the technology. Does that kind of let the engineering leadership and indeed the engineering teams kind of a little bit off the hook, because they're kind of, well, there's two ways to look at it. Either they're being kind of forced then to be almost like, you know, ticket monkeys that just get given stuff and do the things and then give it back. Or in some cases, actually, I've definitely seen teams in the past where actually that's almost like their preferred way of working. Like they want to be given things to kind of go back and forth with. But do you think then that by maybe stepping back a bit from the technology, that it's actually then inviting the technology, the engineering teams, data science teams to kind of move towards the product and move towards the company outcomes rather than just concentrating purely on the tech?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that we need to get to as a team, is that we're all kind of motivated towards a common goal rather than each of our individual practices goals. Because I think what is most important, right? And Mark Abraham wrote a book about tensions in teams, right? And I was quoted in that book twice. And so I appreciate that. I'm sure you have it on your bookshelf. I have it on mine.
Yeah, it's there somewhere.
Yeah. And so like, I think I've always taken to heart that actually like really helpful tensions within the team, even if we're not always speaking the same language, even just trying to pull in those different directions, end up building better decisions in general, right? Because we're not like, and this is where maybe getting to the thing you're talking about, where there are some technical teams that want to just be told exactly what to build. And I think there's a little bit of learned helplessness inside of that, which is that I've been, as an engineer, like beaten so many times that I didn't build the right thing. When the reality is like, we don't know what is the right thing to build. If most of the time when a product manager is involved, it's not known what is the right thing to build. There's a lot of uncertainty and not like, we just don't have the knowledge of what is perfect here. And so, I mean, I would argue that for the teams that know exactly what to build and they're just like dealing with like, say, bugs and customer tickets just to fix, they probably actually don't need a product manager, right? Like they don't need that person there trying to push the innovation of the team and pushing it towards better customer outcomes, better business outcomes. But when we talk about something that's never been built before, at least in this particular context, like we want the product manager to be pulling away from the technical side of it. And now I do think that like maybe there's like an interesting discussion about different types of founders when we talk about like sales-led versus product-led versus engineering-led founders. And I mean, don't tell the other product managers, but I think actually sales-led founders are the best. And the reason why is because they're always going out there and making sure that they're getting something that can be sold, versus the kind of other anti-patterns of like product-led founders trying to build the most beautiful thing possible for the customer, but it's not always as business focused, right? Especially because of that thing you were talking about, where we go back to that part of the Venn diagram that maybe we feel most comfortable with, right? And my background is engineering, so I can understand how like that might feel a little disingenuous. But to be very clear, I sold out right out of school into product management. So I do think that tension, again, is really what we're trying to build in the team. There's a healthy tension that we're able to disagree, we're able to make decisions within the domains of our practice, and that it doesn't mean that we all have to learn each other's. Now, I don't expect an engineer to be, you know, out doing customer calls every single day. I do want them to have exposure to the customers, though. I want them to have exposures to the way that customers talk. Just like I want a PM to then have to think about like, what are the trade-offs of like building something fast versus maintainable, right? And again, I'm not going to use the technical debt term because I hate that term. It's not like a credit card bill. And so I think that's the thing that I really want to get at is that we should be having PMs respecting the practice that they have, which is really being customer focused, helping make decisions, clearing and wrangling with uncertainty, and then doing the communication with the team to make sure we're aligned around the same vision and kind of like end goal around this stuff.
All right, I wanted to ask you for a few seconds for a very quick message from this episode's sponsor. When you're building your business, you occasionally have eureka moments, like when a certain tool becomes a legitimate game changer. That's why I'm here to talk about Leadfeeder, a tool that helps you cut through your data and turn your website visitors into solid leads. Imagine knowing which companies are checking out your site, tracking their behavior, and integrating it all with your CRM. That's exactly what Leadfeeder does for you. Result, it becomes your secret weapon for targeted lead engagement, making it easier for your team to convert website traffic into sales. You can head over to leadfeeder.com/try for a free demo and get a free extended premium trial when you let the rep know you found out about Leadfeeder through the One Night in Product podcast. Check the show notes for more details, but right now, let's get back to the show. So where do you stand then on an acronym which is maybe gaining a little traction these days, CPTOs? And this idea that,
CPTOs, oh gosh.
Exactly. The idea that, you can have one executive leader who's looking after product and technology, or indeed even in some companies where there's almost like a proxy CPTO because there's no CPO at all, and product is a function that reports through the CTO. Like, where do you stand on, well, I guess both of those topics?
I think organizational design is really interesting because of the fact that, like, when we talk about a CPTO, are we really just talking about like a COO at that point? Because once you start molding multiple practices together, you then get into kind of what I would call a GM mode for the organization. Usually, the reason why we would do that at a smaller scale at like a product team level, rather than say at a very large organization, there's like a C-level title, is because we want the escalations to be handled at kind of a smaller level. If we feel that we have to then have functional practice that still goes up to a central person that is a C-level title, I think you end up losing out on the ability to reduce escalations. I think that people end up having to send things so far up the ladder of the hierarchy to get resolved. And again, a lot of this can be helped by, leaders giving better information about strategic trade-offs, understanding how they model these decisions so that the escalations don't have to take place. But I think that as we probably both know, just because you're a leader or someone that has a high head count under you doesn't mean you're a strategic thinker. And so I think maybe that's the thing I would say is I do think that, I don't know, and I just want to be very clear. Like, I have seen where we go up to like very high levels of functional leaders. I've seen that work in some places, but I've also seen the GM model work. So I think this idea of a CPTO is just someone that is like, for the time being, doing this kind of like semi-GM thing. But because you're kind of in the middle, I think that you end up having problems of both and maybe not the benefits of both. So.
But it kind of, to me, almost then smacks of this idea, well, like if you're going to have a CPTO, why can't you have a CPMO or a CPRO or a CPOO or CPEO? I mean, I guess that last one's maybe...
Well, I guess that's a question. Yeah, I guess maybe one of the things I would say is it's kind of like the distinction between more project management style roles, and I would include like program, technical PMs are sometimes put in that bucket. Again, it depends on the organization for that terminology. But anything that's really more about like risk reduction on one side, like we don't want to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. We want to make sure that we're on track in some way, whatever that means, right? We want to make sure that we're reducing or removing dependencies or aligning dependencies in a way that's really helpful. That project management role should be very separate from what a product manager does, right? Which is more about pushing on innovation, trying to understand the uncertainties of the world, trying to like parse and understand how we are resilient inside of a changing landscape. Those to me seem to be on a spectrum. And I think you could then say that like there is a reason why revenue is usually separate from the product team. And it's because there's a different way of doing things to actually sell products to users, even when it comes to like enterprise, right? When you have those two things together, like that, I think that's a really interesting question is like, what would a product and revenue person combined look like? And it would probably be a professional services organization. And so like, I think that's what you start getting into. When you don't have these tensions that are between these places, you end up making, I think, decisions that are not as well aligned with the better goal of the organization. Like I was a program manager at Microsoft right out of school, and that was kind of this unholy combination of project and product management at the time. And so I think we've started to see those two roles start to split apart. And whenever you do see those two things together, I think you end up getting into like, this innovation feels risky, so I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to do the thing that is more clear, is going to be de-risked, right? And that is definitely adverse to what you want as a product manager.
Yeah, like something I say on the sales training stuff that I do is like if you incentivize the product manager exactly the same way that you incentivize the salesperson, for example, I imagine they would be making all of the same decisions that a salesperson does, because of course they would, because you don't have to look too far past how they're motivated and incentivized to kind of understand the behavior.
That's right.
But there's a lot of people out there that would disagree with what you've said around the kind of technical skills. There are a load of courses out there. There's courses on Maven. There's other companies doing education in technical training. There's lots of people on Reddit and LinkedIn and all over the social medias, all asking how to become more technical. And there's lots of developers complaining about non-technical product managers and saying that they don't deliver any value. And even then you may even get people saying that, well, actually, if they're not technical, then anyone could do it. So like,
Yeah.
how does a non-technical product manager,
Yeah.
or how does someone become, I guess, or go towards being less technical in a world where it feels like the entire, well, certainly the bubble that we're in
Yeah.
seems to be like almost expecting that?
Yeah. And I would say that getting better at wrangling the uncertainty of the world, asking better questions, understanding trade-offs, compelling trade-offs, better decision making, those are all things that I think are really powerful and important for these roles that I don't think that just a technical mindset helps you do. And I think that product managers are one of those roles that requires a lot of experience to actually be good at, right? Like at Microsoft, we would say that a PM was not really worth much for the first 2 years of their time because they would probably be going off of like the artifacts and the kind of the frameworks that are there, which are fine. But like at a certain point, you need to start to build this like tacit or intuitive knowledge on how we actually get teams to make these trade-offs or questions. And I mean, I'm actually doing a course on Maven as well. It's called AI Product Design Patterns. And a lot of that course is actually getting people out of the mode of thinking like, usually the first like lecture is like, oh, I want to know like all the depth of how does a machine learning model work. And it's like, that actually doesn't matter. What you need to think about is like, what are the differences about this technology that require different trade-offs within the product team? And that when we talk about the patterns of the way people interact with these services, that is actually way more powerful. And so I think that's the thing is like, all that's happening here, I think a lot of the time is that engineers, the ones that I've worked with that have really benefited and valued the person that is very customer focused, they have been really great engineers. And I'm not going to try to say that there's like anything about good, better, bad, or 10x or any of this other BS that we're talking about. I just think that like to be part of a team, you need to work as a team. And that means you're always valuing the thing that is most important for your practice to be good at. It's like the idea of the heist movie, right? Like, yes, there are times that the person has to step in on something else, but by and large, it's about that person being the expert in their thing. And so I would just argue that that is what we should be focused on as product managers, is all of that stuff about looking at the world in a different way and pushing the team to consider things that they wouldn't consider, and then figure out what is the right decision here. And I think that is actually a very hard skill set. I run a community or co-founded a community called the Uncertainty Project, which is all about like decision making and strategy. And a lot of the tools that are in there are just getting you to like reframe and rethink the world. A lot of the time, I found engineering to be more of a certainty mindset type of practice, right? We eventually have to ship this line of code that sits on a server that does something. And if it doesn't do that, that's bad. And that's why like ML is such like a weird thing. Because like it's not just bugs and like weird socio complexity issues, but it's this idea that there's like non-deterministic systems that are sitting inside of these things. And so I think that's what we need to get to, is that we need to understand that like there is actually a role for someone asking really good questions and forcing decisions to happen in a certain way. And so that's what that's my pitch, at least, for why product management should exist in that way.
Well, I'm sold, but obviously we could spend a lot more time talking about this. Yeah. I'm sure some people will be vehemently typing away on their keyboards as we speak. But
yeah, at me on TikTok. I don't have a TikTok account, but go ahead and at me on TikTok.
But you did kind of just segue neatly into your Maven course, and of course there's probably other ways that people could connect with you as well. So where can people find you after this if they want to find out more, argue with you, or just kind of catch up with what you're up to?
And I always love a good argument, by the way. I'm happy to debate anybody about anything. And so like I would just say LinkedIn. I love connecting with people. And then anything that I talk about, like there's lots of things that I write about strategy, AI, decision-making, randomness in decision-making. And so like that's the best way to kind of keep up on all that stuff is LinkedIn. And then of course, I'd love to hear how this applies to your context, because that's actually what's most important, right? Like this idea of a perfect framework doesn't exist, but the idea of you trying to apply a framework, you trying to apply a framework and then seeing how it works out, that's actually very helpful to me to learn how it worked for you. So please just reach out. I would love to hear about whether this stuff worked or didn't. I would love to hear from you.
Well, absolutely. I'll make sure to link it all in the show notes, and hopefully you'll get some people come and do just that, and not all of them shouting. But as for now, all I can do is thank you very much for your hot take.
Thank you.